Welcome to This Explainer. Let's dive right into an incredibly fascinating corporate mystery. We're looking at the proposed mega merger between Warner Bros. Discovery and Paramount Skydance. But honestly, this isn't just about movies. This is a total masterclass in modern antitrust law. We're going to see how top-tier regulators looked at the exact same deal at the exact same time and walked away with completely different conclusions. It really shows how different views on economics can literally reshape the future of an entire industry.
It's a sheer paradox, right? We have one single merger, the exact same companies involved, but a massive split in the verdicts. A coalition of state attorneys general actually sued to block the merger entirely. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice, the DOJ, cleared it without asking for a single divestiture. And then, looking across the Atlantic, the European Commission cleared it too, but they tacked on one very narrow remedy to protect a specific distribution arrangement. Same exact data. 3 wildly different legal answers.
So to solve this antitrust mystery together, we'll be breaking things down into 6 key areas. 1 merger, defining the market, measuring shares, the bargaining table, the writer's battle, and finally, the bottom line.
All right, Section 1, 1 merger, 3 answers. Let's just start with the chaotic timeline of how these conflicting outcomes all collided in real time over a single summer. The sequence of events here is honestly staggering. In February 2026, the transaction is announced. By June 12th, the DOJ officially closes its investigation, clearing the path. But wait, just a month later, on July 13th, the states sue to block it. Fast forward a mere 9 days to July 22nd, and the EU clears it with a specific remedy. I mean, within just a few short weeks in the summer of 2026, the entire entertainment industry was spun sideways. Regulators effectively scattered in 3 distinct directions, all while looking at the exact same legal and economic facts.
Moving into Section 2. Defining the market. The absolutely crucial point to kick off our investigation is our very first clue, which is the concept of market definition.
Basically, before you can even attempt to measure a monopoly, you have to define who actually counts as a competitor in that specific market. In antitrust terms, you're trying to figure out which specific suppliers and competitors meaningfully constrain the merging companies. Think about it this way. If Paramount and Warner merge, who else is out there forcing them to play fair? If there are tons of alternatives, a merger is usually totally fine. But if there are very few, well, that's exactly when regulators get worried.
The basic structure of the concern here is that if these 2 giants combine, movie theaters lose one independent supplier. But here's the catch. The states, the DOJ, and the EU simply could not agree on how many meaningful alternatives would actually be left for those theaters. The root of the split is that regulators fundamentally disagreed on what the theatrical ecosystem even looks like today.
Breaking that down a bit more, the states took a very narrow view. They argued that anticipated blockbusters are a distinct market, supplied mainly by a small, heavily protected group of legacy major studios. In their eyes, you literally cannot replace a massive tentpole franchise film with a small indie movie. The DOJ, on the other hand, looked at a much wider, more dynamic landscape. They argued that independent studios and newer tech companies doing streaming are becoming totally vital theatrical suppliers. So you can see this is a massive philosophical divide on what a competitor actually looks like.
Okay, Section 3, measuring market shares. Let's move to our next clue and see how this builds. Because even if regulators did manage to agree on the market definition, they face a massive secondary hurdle in their antitrust investigation.
And it brings up a really critical question. What should market shares actually measure? Think about it. If you actually win the argument about who belongs in the market, say you agree with the states that only blockbusters matter, how do you practically measure their competitive significance? Because, as it turns out, determining what belongs in a market and deciding how to measure market shares are 2 entirely separate, highly contested questions. Winning Step 1 absolutely does not automatically answer Step 2. The states relied on historical box office revenue to measure market share. They calculated what's known as an HHI, which is a structural concentration figure. Now, on the surface, that makes total sense, right? Box office receipts are highly visible and easy to compare. But the actual economic meaning behind that simple arithmetic is highly debated.
The real problem with historical box office revenue is that it's a realized commercial outcome. It is not a pure measure of market power. Box office revenue is this incredibly volatile mix of franchise popularity, marketing budgets, and honestly, sheer unpredictable luck. I mean, nobody can perfectly predict the next surprise summer blockbuster phenomenon. It also depends on the screens and showtimes that the theater exhibitors themselves decide to allocate.
A surprise hit or an unexpected massive flop can totally skew a studio's annual share. So at the end of the day, that number doesn't necessarily tell us how much bargaining leverage a theater actually loses if Paramount and Warner combine.
That takes us right into Section 4, the bargaining table. This brings us directly to the interrogation room, the real-world bargaining table between film distributors and theater exhibitors. This is really where the antitrust rubber meets the road.
Theatrical licensing isn't like you or me going to a store and paying a set price on a tag. It's a deeply complex, negotiated process over a whole package of terms. We're talking revenue splits, screen allocations, showtimes, run links. The studio brings the blockbuster movie, the massive marketing campaign, and the expected demand. But the theater exhibitor brings the scarce, perishable capacity. They have the physical screens, the peak Friday night showtimes, and the direct access to the local audience.
So we can't just look at the math, we absolutely have to look at the human leverage. Because a theater risks massive, compounding losses if they actually walk away from a major blockbuster during a negotiation. If they reject a highly anticipated film, they don't just lose ticket sales, they lose all that lucrative concession revenue. You know, those incredibly overpriced tubs of popcorn? And even worse, they might lose their loyal customers who will just drive down the street to a competing local theater. So the real antitrust question becomes, does keeping Paramount and Warner separate actually improve the theater's alternatives and leverage to avoid these losses?
Section 5. The writers' separate battle. What about the people actually creating these films? That introduces a totally fascinating B-plot to our investigation that was happening at the exact same time.
Literally just a day after the states sued, the Writers Guild filed a completely separate lawsuit that completely flips the script. Instead of focusing on a monopoly seller power, they focused on monopsony buyer power. Now, a monopsony is a market condition where there's only one buyer, or a highly consolidated group of buyers, dictating terms to suppliers. In this scenario, Paramount and Warner aren't just selling movies to theaters, they're buying scripts and creative labor from writers.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is that fighting over creative labor and scripts is a totally distinct economic battlefield compared to distributing finished films to movie theaters. The Writers Guild argued that combining these two massive studios severely reduces competition among buyers for their creative inputs. As our sources point out, you just can't treat this as another version of the state's case. It involves entirely different trading partners, different alternatives, and requires its own unique evidence of market power.
Bringing us to Section 6, the bottom line. Let's move to our final synthesis to really understand the ultimate verdict on this divided antitrust landscape and what it all means for how we look at corporate megamergers going forward.
When you boil it all down, the core dispute really comes down to this. Structural concentration figures, those HHI numbers based purely on box office revenue, they are absolutely useful. They highlight past commercial success, audience demand, and slate strength. But they completely miss the invisible leverage of the next best alternative. They just don't directly capture how often Paramount and Warner actually constrain each other in a real-world boardroom, or whether a smaller independent studio could provide enough leverage for a theater to actually push back on a bad deal.
Market definition tells us who gets counted, but it doesn't automatically tell us what that count actually means in the real messy world of deal-making. As we've seen through the varying decisions of the states, the DOJ, and the EU, antitrust law in a dynamic industry is rarely ever black and white. So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought. Can historical structural math truly predict the future of human bargaining? Think about that the next time you see a massive corporate megamerger making the front page.
Thanks for watching. For the deep dive economic analysis behind these stories, join us at econworks.com. Subscribe to stay informed on where law and economics meet the market. We'll see you in the next episode.